The rock slide had taken out 30 feet of fence line, and Claire Mendoza knew she'd spend the better part of a morning repairing it before the cattle found the gap and decided the national forest looked greener than her pasture. She stood at the base of the scree field where Montana's crazy mountains met her property line, surveying the damage with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent the last 3 years learning that ranch work was 90% problem-solving and 10% everything else. The slide had come down during last night's storm, tons of limestone and shale breaking loose from the ridge above, carrying fence posts and wire down the slope in a tangle that would take hours to clear. Her back already ached just looking at it. Beside her, Sergeant sniffed along the debris field with the methodical focus that marked all his working hours. The German Shepherd had been her partner for 4 years, 2 of them in Afghanistan, where he'd worked explosive detection with her Marine Corps military police unit, and 2 more here in Montana, where he'd transitioned to ranch life with the same steady competence he brought to everything. His nose could find anything from tripwires to missing calves, and right now he was telling her something in the rock slide interested him beyond simple geological rearrangement. She watched him work the scent cone, moving upslope toward a section where the limestone had split open to reveal a cavity behind it. His tail went rigid, and he sat, the trained alert that meant he'd found something worth her attention. Claire picked her way up through the loose rock, boots finding purchase on stones still settling from their fall, and crouched beside him. "What have you got, Sarge?" He looked at her, then back at the cavity, and whined softly. Not his explosive alert, not his stranger alert, just confusion paired with interest. She pulled a flashlight from her jacket and played the beam into the opening. The cavity extended back perhaps 6 feet, a pocket in the limestone that had probably been sealed for thousands of years before last night's storm broke it open. And in the back of that pocket, arranged in a rough circular pattern, sat 7 smooth oval objects, each about the size of a football. Claire's first thought was geodes, mineral formations that could grow large in these mountains. But geodes didn't sit in organized patterns, and they didn't have the uniform shape these objects displayed. She reached in carefully, testing the nearest one, and found it surprisingly light, the surface textured in a way that reminded her of leather more than stone. She lifted it out and turned it in the sunlight, pale grey-green, with subtle patterns running across the shell in irregular bands. Definitely not a geode. She'd seen plenty of strange things during her 3 years ranching, from perfectly preserved Ice Age bison skulls eroding out of creek banks to strange rock formations that looked like alien artifacts but turned out to be iron concretions. Montana's geology could produce surprises that strained credibility. But these objects, these smooth ovals that weighed less than they should and felt almost warm in her hands, pushed past surprise into territory that made her heart rate kick up the way it used to before patrols outside the wire. Sergeant whined again, and Claire looked at him. "Yeah, I know. This is weird." She set the object down carefully and pulled out her phone, taking photos from multiple angles before the morning light shifted. The images showed what her eyes reported, but somehow failed to capture the strangeness of the find, the sense that these objects existed slightly outside normal categories. She pocketed the phone and looked at the other 6 objects still sitting in the limestone cavity. 7 total, arranged in a pattern that suggested deliberate placement, or perhaps just the physics of how they'd settled when they'd been deposited here. When had they been deposited? The limestone around them looked ancient, part of the mountain's fundamental structure, which meant these things had been here for a very long time. But the cavity itself showed no signs of previous opening, no weathering or erosion that would suggest repeated exposure to the elements. Whatever had placed these objects here had sealed them away so thoroughly that only a rockslide during a Montana spring storm could reveal them. Claire made a decision that felt both obvious and somehow weighted with consequence. She couldn't leave them here, exposed to weather and scavengers and curious cattle. She needed to get them somewhere secure, somewhere she could figure out what they were and what to do about them. She jogged back down to her truck and retrieved an old wool blanket and a plastic storage tote from the toolbox, then climbed back up to the cavity. Working carefully, she wrapped each object in sections of the blanket and loaded them into the tote. They nested together surprisingly well, as though designed to fit in close proximity, and the tote settled into her arms with less weight than its volume suggested. She carried it down the slope, Sergeant ranging ahead, and loaded it into the truck's cab, where she could keep an eye on it. The fence repair took 3 hours, long enough for the sun to climb high and the day to warm into genuine spring weather. Claire worked with wire stretchers and post drivers, re-anchoring the damaged section, while her mind kept circling back to the objects sitting in her truck. What were they? Who could she ask, without triggering a response that would bring authorities and scientists and bureaucratic complications she didn't need? She'd bought this ranch because it offered distance from the hypervigilance and constant assessment that had marked her service years, a place where she could work at her own pace and make decisions that affected only cattle and grass and the slow turn of seasons. But finding 7 mysterious objects in a sealed limestone cavity felt like the kind of discovery that would complicate everything if handled wrong. So she needed to handle it right, which meant gathering information before making any official reports. She finished the fence work around noon, testing the tension and walking the line to ensure everything held secure. Satisfied, she loaded her tools and drove back to the ranch house with Sergeant riding shotgun and the storage tote secured between them. The house sat in a valley between ridges, a century-old log structure she'd renovated slowly, replacing rot and updating systems while keeping the bones that had survived 5 generations of Montana winters. It felt solid and defensible, and hers in a way nothing in her adult life had felt before. She carried the tote inside and set it on the kitchen table, then made coffee while trying to decide her next move. Call the university in Bozeman, maybe, see if the geology department could identify them without requiring a formal report. Or contact the county extension office, though that would mean explaining where she'd found them and probably triggering some kind of archaeological survey. Or simply do nothing for a few days. Keep them secure and see if research could identify them without involving others at all. The coffee finished brewing, and Claire poured a cup, adding sugar while she pulled up a browser on her laptop. A search for smooth oval objects found in limestone returned thousands of hits, most of them geological, but a few that made her stop scrolling. Fossil eggs. Dinosaur eggs. Preserved in limestone and sandstone formations around the world, some of them millions of years old, intact, and occasionally still containing fossilized embryos. She looked at the tote, at the blanket-wrapped shapes visible through the translucent plastic, and felt her certainty shift. Could they be fossil eggs? Montana had rich paleontological history, sites where dinosaur bones emerged from eroding badlands and ancient lakebeds. The State Museum in Bozeman had entire exhibits dedicated to creatures that had walked this ground 65 million years ago. Finding fossilized eggs wouldn't be unprecedented, just rare and scientifically valuable, and definitely something that required expert assessment. Claire opened the tote and carefully unwrapped one of the objects. In the better light of her kitchen, details became visible that she'd missed at the rockslide site. The surface wasn't perfectly smooth, but showed fine texture, almost like pores or grain. The color had subtle variations, darker bands that might be mineralization or original pigmentation preserved through geological time. And when she held it to her ear, she could have sworn she heard something, a faint sound that might have been her imagination or the acoustic properties of hollow space. She set it down and pulled up the university website, navigating to the Earth Sciences Department. The faculty directory listed a Dr. Michael Torres, Associate Professor of Paleontology, with research interests that included Cretaceous fauna of the Northern Rockies. His contact information sat right there, email and office phone, an invitation to reach out with questions or discoveries. Claire stared at the screen for a long moment, then closed the laptop without sending a message. Not yet. She needed time to think, to understand what she'd found before she let experts take over and turn her discovery into their project. If you've ever found something that changed how you understood the world, she thought, maybe you'd want to hear what happened next. She spent the afternoon doing normal ranch work, feeding cattle and checking water systems and fixing a gate hinge that had been annoying her for 2 weeks. The routine helped settle her mind, gave her hands something to do while her thoughts worked through implications and possibilities. Sargent stayed close, more attentive than usual, as though he sensed her unsettled state and was offering the steady presence that had gotten them both through difficult moments. By evening, Claire had convinced herself the objects were probably fossil eggs and that she should contact Dr. Torres in the morning. Fossils were cool, scientifically important, but they were also inert, ancient, removed from present concerns by millions of years of geological time. She could share her discovery with paleontologists without worrying that it would disrupt her life or bring unwanted attention. They'd probably want to survey the site, maybe excavate the cavity further to see if more fossils remained, and she'd cooperate fully because that was the responsible thing to do with significant finds. She made dinner, fed Sargent, and settled on the couch with a book while the sun dropped behind the western ridge. The storage tote sat on the kitchen table where she'd left it, and she found her attention drifting to it every few pages, wondering about the creatures that had laid those eggs and the world they'd inhabited. Montana had been different then, warmer and wetter, with inland seas and subtropical forests where now only grass and pine grew. The animals that had roamed here were nothing like the cattle and deer and elk that defined the current landscape. Around 9 p.m., Sargent stood from his bed near the wood stove and moved to the kitchen, ears forward. Claire set down her book and followed him. He was staring at the tote, his posture rigid with attention, and that soft whine building in his throat again. She moved closer and heard it then, distinct and undeniable. A faint tapping sound, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from inside the tote. Her first rational thought was thermal expansion, temperature differentials causing the objects to settle or shift against each other. But the tapping had structure, a pattern that repeated with variations, and it came from a specific location in the tote, not from general movement. Claire lifted the lid slowly, and the sound grew clearer. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap. It was coming from one of the wrapped objects, the one she'd handled most during the day. She unwrapped it carefully, half expecting to find a crack or fissure that would explain the sound through mundane physics. What she found instead stopped her breath. The surface of the object showed a small bulge, perhaps an inch across, and even as she watched, the bulge moved, pushing outward in a rhythm that matched the tapping. Something inside was moving. Something inside was alive. Claire set the object down on the table with hands that shook slightly. This wasn't a fossil. This was an egg, an actual egg, and something was trying to hatch from it. The rational part of her mind, the part trained to assess threats and make quick decisions under pressure, started cataloguing impossibilities. Eggs didn't remain viable for millions of years. Dinosaurs were extinct. Whatever this was, it couldn't be what it appeared to be. But the tapping continued, insistent and rhythmic, and the bulge grew larger as whatever was inside worked against the shell. Claire grabbed her phone and started recording video, capturing the movement and sound, evidence she might need later when explaining how a perfectly normal ranch morning had turned into something that defied every law of paleontology and biology. The bulge suddenly fractured, a hairline crack appearing in the shell's surface. Claire jerked back, and Sargent barked once, sharp and urgent. The crack widened, and through the opening came a sound, a high-pitched chirp that might have been distress or effort or simple communication. More cracks appeared, radiating from the first fracture, and pieces of shell began to fall away, revealing glimpses of what lay beneath. Dark scales, slick with some kind of fluid, and the edge of something that looked disturbingly like a claw. Claire's hands found her phone, and she dialed the first number her panicked mind could retrieve. Jake Moreno, her nearest neighbor, and the one person within 20 miles who might have any context for what was happening. He answered after 3 rings, his voice rough with early sleep. "Claire, what's wrong? I need you to come over, right now, and bring your biology background. It's 9:30 at night. I know what time it is. Jake, I found something, and I think it's hatching, and I need someone who understands this kind of thing to tell me I'm not losing my mind." A pause. Jake had been a wildlife biologist before retiring to Montana, spending 30 years studying everything from grizzly bears to sage grouse for the Forest Service. If anyone could make sense of this, he could. Hatching. What kind of egg are we talking about? I don't know. Just get here, please. Give me 20 minutes. The call ended, and Claire turned back to the egg. More shell had fallen away, and she could see clearly now what was emerging. A small reptilian creature, perhaps 6 inches long, with dark scales that glistened in the kitchen light. It had 4 limbs, each tipped with tiny claws, and a long tail that thrashed weakly as it worked to free itself from the shell. The head was triangular, with large eyes that hadn't yet opened, and a snout that pushed against the remaining shell fragments. It was beautiful and impossible and terrifying all at once, and Claire stood frozen, watching as the creature completed its birth into a world that hadn't expected it. The last pieces of shell fell away, and the hatchling lay on the table, breathing rapidly, its small body pulsing with effort. It chirped again, louder now, and turned its head toward Claire as though sensing her presence, even with eyes still sealed. Sargent had retreated to the far side of the kitchen, his uncertainty clear. He'd never seen anything like this, and his training provided no framework for assessment. Friend or threat, prey or predator, the categories that usually guided his responses didn't apply to whatever this creature was. Claire forced herself to move, to think past shock into practical action. The hatchling would need warmth, probably food, definitely water. She grabbed a towel and lined a cardboard box with it, creating a nest of sorts, then gently scooped the creature into the box using a wooden spoon to avoid direct contact. It chirped again when she moved it, a sound of protest or disorientation, and curled into a tight ball, with its tail wrapped around its body. Headlights swept across the front windows, and Jake's truck pulled into the yard. Claire met him at the door, and one look at her face told him this was no routine late-night crisis. He was in his 60s, lean and weathered, with the quiet competence that came from decades in the backcountry. He stepped inside, saw the scattered shell fragments and the box with its small inhabitant, and stopped. "What is that?" "That's what I'm hoping you can tell me." Jake moved closer, crouching beside the box, and studied the hatchling with the intensity of someone whose career had been built on careful observation. After a minute, he looked up at Claire. "Where did you find this?" "In a rock slide this morning. 7 eggs, sealed in a limestone cavity. This is the only one that's shown any signs of activity. And you brought them all home." "I didn't know what else to do." Jake stood and paced the kitchen, thinking. This looks reptilian, but the proportions are wrong for any modern species. The limb structure, the tail length, the scale pattern, it's all outside normal variation for anything currently alive. Could it be some kind of relict population? Something that's been isolated and evolved separately? No. Look at it, Claire. This thing is morphologically distinct from anything in the current fossil record. If it were just a rare species, we'd have found bones, scat, tracks, something. But this, he gestured to the hatchling, this doesn't fit anywhere in the contemporary ecosystem. So, what are you saying? Jake looked at her, and his expression carried the weight of someone making a statement that would change everything. I'm saying this might be a dinosaur. The word hung in the air between them, too large and too strange for the kitchen of a Montana ranch house. Claire wanted to argue, to find some alternative explanation that didn't require rewriting everything she understood about extinction and geological time. But the evidence sat in a cardboard box, breathing and occasionally chirping, undeniable and absolutely present. "That's impossible," she said finally. "Dinosaurs died out 65 million years ago. Most did, but we know birds are direct descendants. Living dinosaurs, if you want to be technical, and we're still finding new things in the fossil record all the time, species we didn't know existed. What if something survived? What if conditions allowed a small population to persist in isolation, maybe in caves or thermal areas where the environment remained stable? For 65 million years? No, probably not that long. But maybe long enough that eggs deposited in the right conditions could remain viable. We've seen fish eggs survive decades in dried lake beds. Some seeds can remain dormant for centuries. If the limestone sealed these eggs at the right temperature and humidity, maybe prevented decay and bacterial infiltration, it's not impossible that they could remain viable for an extended period. Claire wanted to believe him, wanted the explanation that made this situation manageable. But even as she considered it, doubts crowded in. We need to call someone. The university, the state paleontologist, someone who can actually assess what we're dealing with. And tell them what? That you found a living dinosaur that just hatched in your kitchen. They'll think you're crazy or running some kind of hoax. Then we show them. We have evidence. We have the other eggs. We have this. She pointed to the hatchling. Jake nodded slowly. Okay, but let's wait until morning. This thing is fragile right now, stressed from hatching, and we need to make sure it survives the night before we start bringing in scientists and officials. Do you have any heat lamps, something we can use to keep it warm? I've got heat lamps for the chicken coop. Get one. And we'll need water. Maybe try offering some food, though I'm not sure what it would eat at this stage. They spent the next hour setting up what amounted to an improvised incubator, positioning the heat lamp to maintain the box's temperature around 80 degrees and placing a shallow dish of water inside. The hatchling drank eagerly when Jake dipped its snout toward the water, a good sign that its instincts were functioning. Food would be trickier. If it was indeed a dinosaur, its dietary needs would depend on what type, and they had no way of knowing whether it was herbivorous or carnivorous. Around midnight, Jake finally headed home with promises to return at first light. Claire sat at the kitchen table, watching the box and the small creature inside it, and tried to process the magnitude of what was happening. She'd found something that shouldn't exist, brought it into her home, and now bore responsibility for its survival and whatever came next. The weight of that responsibility pressed down with the same intensity she'd felt during her service years, when decisions carried life and death consequences and mistakes couldn't be undone. Sargent eventually moved closer to the box, his curiosity overcoming his caution. He sniffed carefully at the edges, then sat beside the table in a posture that suggested he'd accepted guard duty. Claire reached down and scratched behind his ears, grateful for his steady presence. What do you think, Sarge? Did we just make the biggest discovery in paleontology, or the biggest mistake in my ranching career? He didn't answer, just maintained his watch, and Claire took comfort in his acceptance of the strange situation. If Sargent could adapt, so could she. She tried to sleep around 2 a.m., but every sound from the kitchen brought her fully awake, wondering if the hatchling was in distress or if more eggs were showing signs of activity. By dawn, she'd given up on rest and made coffee, standing at the kitchen window and watching the sun paint the crazy mountains in shades of pink and gold. The landscape looked exactly as it had yesterday, unchanged and indifferent to the impossible thing happening in her home. Jake arrived with the sunrise, bringing a cooler full of various food options: mealworms, crickets, leafy greens, fruit, even some raw hamburger. They tried offering different items to the hatchling, who by now had opened its eyes and was moving around the box with increasing confidence. It ignored the vegetables and fruit, but snapped eagerly at a mealworm Jake dangled in front of it, swallowing the worm whole before chirping for more. "Carnivore," Jake said with satisfaction. "That narrows the possibilities. We're probably looking at a theropod of some kind, maybe a small raptor or early tyrannosaur. The limb proportions support that. You sound way too excited about this." "Are you kidding? This is the discovery of the millennium. If this thing is real, if it's actually what it appears to be, it rewrites everything we know about extinction events and species survival." Claire fed the hatchling several more mealworms, watching it eat with surprising efficiency for something only hours old. Its movements were becoming more coordinated, and it seemed to be imprinting on her, following her hand movements and chirping when she pulled away. The bond forming between them was both touching and concerning. What would happen when this creature grew? What would it become? "We need to make that call," she said. "This is too big to handle alone." Jake nodded. "Agreed. But let's be strategic about who we contact. The wrong person could turn this into a circus. We need someone who'll prioritize the science and the creature's welfare over publicity or political gain." They spent the morning researching paleontologists and wildlife biologists in the region, looking for someone with the right combination of expertise and discretion. Claire eventually found a name that kept appearing in academic papers and museum publications. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, curator of paleontology at the Museum of the Rockies in Bozeman. Her research focused on Montana dinosaurs, and her CV suggested someone who'd spent more time in the field than in front of cameras. Claire composed an email that tried to sound rational while conveying the urgency of the situation. "Dr. Mitchell, I'm a rancher in Park County, and I've made a discovery that requires immediate expert assessment. I found what appear to be fossilized eggs in a limestone cavity on my property, but one of them has hatched. I know how this sounds, but I have video documentation and the creature itself. This is not a hoax. I need your help to determine what we're dealing with and how to proceed. Please contact me as soon as possible." She attached several photos and the video she'd taken the previous night, then hit send before she could second-guess the decision. The email disappeared into the digital void, and all they could do was wait. The response came 90 minutes later, faster than Claire had dared hope. "Ms. Mendoza, I've reviewed your attachments. If this is genuine, it represents an unprecedented discovery. I can be at your location this afternoon. Please do not contact anyone else or post about this on social media. Time-sensitive situations like this require careful handling to protect both the specimen and the scientific process. I'll bring appropriate equipment and documentation protocols." Claire sent her address and directions, then spent the next hours cleaning the house and trying to make the kitchen look less like a disaster area. The remaining 6 eggs sat in their storage tote, showing no signs of activity, but she kept checking them obsessively, wondering if more hatchlings would emerge and what she'd do if they did. Dr. Mitchell arrived at 2 p.m., driving a university van loaded with equipment. She was younger than Claire expected, maybe early 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of focused energy that suggested she'd driven the 2 hours from Bozeman at speeds that exceeded posted limits. Jake met her at the door, and they handled introductions while Claire retrieved the box with its tiny inhabitant. Sarah Mitchell looked at the hatchling for 10 full seconds without speaking. Then she set down her equipment bag, pulled out gloves and a measuring tape, and said in a voice that shook slightly, "I'm going to need to examine this creature and collect samples. May I?" "Of course." The examination took an hour. Sarah measured, photographed, collected scale samples and a tiny blood draw that made the hatchling chirp in protest. She documented every aspect of its morphology, muttering observations into a digital recorder, occasionally stopping to shake her head in apparent disbelief. Finally, she sat back and looked at Claire and Jake. "This is real. This is actually real. The morphology is consistent with a juvenile theropod, possibly a troodontid, based on the tooth structure and limb proportions. But the tissue samples will tell us more. I need to get these to the lab immediately, run genetic analysis and cell structure studies. So it is a dinosaur, Claire said. It appears to be, which should be impossible, but here we are. Sarah stood and paced the kitchen, thinking out loud. The eggs must have been sealed immediately after laying, probably by a mudslide or volcanic event that created perfect preservation conditions. The limestone formed around them, creating an anaerobic environment that prevented decay. Temperature and humidity remained constant, possibly aided by geothermal activity in the region, and somehow, improbably, the embryos remained viable. For how long? Jake asked. That's what the genetic analysis will tell us. We can measure degradation in the DNA, estimate how much time has passed since these eggs were laid. But even a conservative estimate, we're probably talking about tens of thousands of years at minimum, possibly much longer. Claire looked at the hatchling, who had curled up under the heat lamp and appeared to be sleeping. What happens now? Now we need to make decisions quickly. This creature is scientifically invaluable, but it's also a living being that deserves appropriate care. We need to establish a secure facility with proper environmental controls, nutrition, and veterinary oversight. We need to assemble a team of experts who can provide round-the-clock monitoring. And we need to do all of this quietly before word gets out and this situation becomes unmanageable. What about the other eggs? They need to be moved to controlled conditions immediately. If more are viable, we can't risk losing them to temperature fluctuations or humidity changes. I've got incubation equipment at the museum that can maintain optimal conditions. And then what? Claire heard the edge in her own voice, the protective instinct that had kicked in the moment she'd watched the creature struggle free of its shell. You take them, you study them, and I never see them again? Sarah's expression softened. You found them, Claire. That makes you part of this story, but this discovery is bigger than any one person's claim to it. These creatures, if they survive, could provide insights into evolutionary biology, extinction dynamics, maybe even help us understand climate change impacts on species survival. That knowledge belongs to everyone. Claire wanted to argue, to assert her right to the things she'd found on her own property, but she knew Sarah was right. This wasn't about ownership or pride. This was about something that transcended individual interests and required the kind of expertise and resources she couldn't provide alone. Okay, but I want to be involved. I want updates. I want to know how that hatchling's doing, and if any of the other eggs hatch, I want to be there. Deal. Sarah offered her hand and they shook on it. Now let's get these eggs loaded up. The sooner we get them to controlled conditions, the better their chances of survival. They spent the next hour carefully packing the 6 remaining eggs in a temperature-controlled container Sarah had brought, cushioning each one with foam inserts designed for transporting fragile specimens. The hatchling, now named Hope by unspoken consensus, would travel with Sarah in a specialized carrier that maintained heat and humidity. Claire signed documents transferring temporary custody to the museum, with provisions that acknowledged her as the discoverer and guaranteed her continued involvement in the research. As Sarah loaded the van, Jake pulled Claire aside. You did the right thing. I know it doesn't feel good letting them go, but Hope needs more than we can provide. I know, but I hatched that egg. I saw her break free. That creates a bond, you know? Yeah, I do. Sarah returned to the house for final instructions and contact information. I'll call you tonight with an update, and as soon as we get the genetic results back, probably 48 to 72 hours, we'll have a better understanding of what we're dealing with. In the meantime, please don't discuss this with anyone. I know that's asking a lot, but premature publicity could compromise the science and put Hope at risk from people who'd want to exploit this situation. Claire agreed, though she wondered how long they could keep something this significant quiet. Sarah drove away with Hope and the other eggs secured in the van, and Claire stood in her yard watching the dust settle on the access road. She felt empty, as though something important had been taken from her, even though she'd given it freely. Sargent pressed against her leg, and she knelt beside him, wrapping her arms around his solid frame. "We did good, right? We found something important and made sure it went to people who could take care of it." He licked her face, his version of agreement or comfort or simple presence, and Claire held on to him while the afternoon sun warmed her back, and the crazy mountain stood witness to a discovery that would ripple forward through time in ways she couldn't predict. The next days passed in a strange suspension, Claire going through ranch routines while her mind stayed focused on Hope and the other eggs. Sarah called every evening with updates. Hope was thriving, eating voraciously, growing at a rate that suggested accelerated development. The other eggs showed no signs of activity yet, but monitoring equipment detected faint movements inside several of them, suggesting additional hatchlings might emerge soon. The genetic results arrived on day 3, and Sarah's voice on the phone carried barely controlled excitement. "Claire, you need to sit down for this. The DNA analysis shows this creature is indeed a dinosaur, specifically a troodontid related to species found in the Hell Creek Formation. But here's the remarkable part. The genetic degradation suggests these eggs were laid approximately 12,000 years ago, not 65 million. Claire's mind struggled to process that timeline. But dinosaurs were extinct 12,000 years ago. Most were, but apparently not all. What we're seeing suggests a relict population that survived the extinction event and persisted for millions of years in isolation before finally dying out relatively recently. These eggs might be from the very last generation of dinosaurs on Earth. That's incredible. It's revolutionary. It means extinction isn't always absolute, that species can find refugia where they hang on long past when we assume they vanished. It also means Hope might be the last living link to a biological lineage that spans more than 200 million years. The weight of that statement settled over Claire. Hope wasn't just a scientific curiosity. She was a survivor from a lost world, a representative of creatures that had witnessed the rise and fall of entire geological epochs. And Claire had been the one to bring her into the present, to midwife her arrival into a time and place so different from the world of her origin that adaptation might be impossible. "How is she doing?" Claire asked. "Amazingly well. She's imprinted on the staff here, follows us around like a puppy. Her coordination is improving daily, and her appetite is insatiable. We've started her on a diet of insects and small rodents, which she handles like a natural predator. If she keeps growing at this rate, she'll outgrow her current enclosure within weeks. Can I come see her?" "Of course, I was going to invite you anyway. We're planning to move her to a larger facility this weekend, something with more space and better environmental controls. You should be here for that." Claire made the drive to Bozeman that Saturday, Sargent riding beside her in the truck. The Museum of the Rockies sat on the Montana State University campus, a sprawling complex that housed one of the world's premier collections of dinosaur fossils. Sarah met them at a side entrance and led them through corridors lined with displays of ancient bones and reconstruction models into a restricted research area where Hope's temporary enclosure had been established. The hatchling had grown significantly in just 5 days. She was now nearly a foot long, her scales darker and more defined, her movements confident and purposeful. When she saw Claire, she chirped loudly and rushed to the enclosure's glass wall, pressing against it with clear recognition. Claire's throat tightened. The bond hadn't faded. If anything, it had strengthened, despite the physical separation. "Can I interact with her?" Claire asked. "Briefly. We don't want to over-socialize her, but she's clearly bonded with you, and maintaining that connection might help her long-term psychological health." Sarah opened her access panel, and Claire entered the enclosure with Sargent held back by Jake, who'd driven up separately. Hope chirped excitedly and climbed up Claire's leg, her tiny claws finding purchase in the denim until she perched on Claire's shoulder. The weight was negligible, but the trust was profound. This creature who should not exist chose to sit on her shoulder and make soft chirping sounds that might have been contentment. Claire spent 20 minutes in the enclosure, letting Hope explore her hands and face with careful movements, feeding her mealworms from a dish Sarah provided, simply being present with a creature from another time. When she finally had to leave, Hope's distress was clear, her chirps turning to louder calls that sounded remarkably like protest or grief. "She'll settle down once you're gone," Sarah assured her, "but I want to discuss something with you. Hope is going to need long-term care, a permanent facility where she can live out her natural lifespan. We're working with the university to establish something appropriate, but it's going to take time and resources. In the meantime, I'm wondering if you'd consider hosting her at your ranch, at least temporarily. We can set up a proper enclosure, provide food and veterinary support, but having her in a familiar environment with a person she's bonded with might be better for her development than keeping her in a laboratory setting." Claire hadn't expected that offer, and it took her a moment to process the implications. Having Hope at the ranch would mean responsibility, constant attention, probably media scrutiny once the discovery became public. But it would also mean maintaining the connection she'd formed, ensuring Hope received care that prioritized her welfare over scientific convenience. "I'll do it," she said. "Whatever she needs, I'll provide it." "Good. We'll start construction next week. In the meantime, keep thinking about what this discovery means and how you want to be involved going forward. Because this story is just beginning, and you're at the center of it, whether you're ready or not." The drive home gave Claire time to think about Sarah's words, about the life changes coming whether she welcomed them or not. She'd bought the ranch for solitude and simplicity, a place to heal from the intensity of war and service. Now she'd be hosting a living dinosaur, collaborating with scientists, probably facing public attention that would shatter the quiet she'd carefully constructed. But looking at Sargent in the passenger seat, at the mountains rolling past the window, Claire realized she wouldn't change what had happened. Finding those eggs, watching Hope hatch, being present for something that expanded human understanding of the possible, that mattered in ways her isolated ranching life never could. She'd been given a chance to contribute to something larger than herself, and turning away from that felt like a betrayal of the values that had led her to serve in the first place. Over the next weeks, a team from the museum transformed a section of Claire's property into a specialized enclosure for Hope. They built a climate-controlled structure with viewing windows, heat lamps, multiple zones for sleeping and playing, and security systems that would alert if anything went wrong. The construction attracted attention from neighbors and passers-by, and Claire fielded questions with vague explanations about a wildlife research project, knowing the truth would emerge soon enough. Hope moved into her new home on a Tuesday morning in late April. She'd grown to nearly 2 feet long now, her features becoming more defined, her hunting instincts sharp enough that Sarah had started bringing live prey for her to practice on. In her new enclosure, Hope explored every corner with intense curiosity, chirping with what sounded like approval when she discovered the heated rocks and water feature. Claire visited multiple times daily, maintaining the bond while allowing Hope increasing independence. Watching the creature grow and develop felt like raising something between a puppy and a wild animal, affectionate but unpredictable, trusting but never fully domesticated. Hope responded to her voice, came when called, would even perch on her shoulder during feeding times. But there was always an edge of otherness, a reminder that this was a predator from another age adapting to a world it was never meant to inhabit. The second egg hatched 3 weeks after Hope's emergence, this time at the museum where monitoring equipment caught the first signs of activity. Sarah called Claire immediately, and she made the 2-hour drive in record time, arriving just as the hatchling broke free of its shell. This one was smaller than Hope had been, with lighter scales and slightly different proportions that Sarah identified as sexual dimorphism. They named him Shadow, and after a week of assessment, he joined Hope in the ranch enclosure. The two hatchlings bonded immediately, engaging in what looked like play behavior, chasing each other and mock-fighting with none of the aggression that would develop as they matured. Claire watched them interact and felt something like parental pride, mixed with awareness that their future remained uncertain. What would happen when they reached adult size? Could they ever be integrated into an ecosystem? Would they live their entire lives in captivity, the last members of a species that had no place in the modern world? The third egg hatched a month later, and the fourth 2 weeks after that. By summer's end, Claire had 5 juvenile dinosaurs living on her property, and the secret could no longer hold. A journalist working on a story about Montana paleontology discovered references to unusual activity at the Museum of the Rockies and started asking questions. Sarah and Claire decided to get ahead of the revelation, scheduling a press conference where they presented their findings and the surviving hatchlings to the world. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Media from around the world descended on Montana, wanting interviews, photos, video footage. Scientists petitioned for access to study the creatures. Conservation groups raised questions about ethics and welfare. The government got involved, establishing protocols for management of what they termed extant prehistoric species. Claire's quiet ranch became a focal point for debates about science, nature, humanity's responsibility to species we'd assumed were extinct. Through it all, Claire maintained her role as primary caretaker, the person the dinosaurs trusted most. She worked with Sarah and a growing team of experts to ensure the creatures received appropriate care, made decisions about their housing and enrichment, advocated for their interests in meetings that sometimes felt more political than scientific. It was exhausting and often frustrating, but seeing the dinosaurs thrive made every challenge worthwhile. The other 3 eggs never hatched. Despite optimal conditions and constant monitoring, they remained inert, their occupants either non-viable or so deeply dormant that no intervention could wake them. They were preserved for future study, potential resources if science advanced enough to attempt some form of revival or cloning. By the following spring, Hope had reached adult size, nearly 6 feet long and powerfully built, her scales darkened to deep charcoal with amber highlights. She moved with lethal grace, every inch the apex predator her species had been millions of years ago. But she also recognized Claire's voice, would calm at her presence, demonstrated trust that seemed to transcend the vast evolutionary distance between dinosaur and human. Standing in the enclosure one April morning, watching Hope and the other 4 juveniles interact in the dawn light, Claire thought about the journey from that first rock slide to this moment. She'd found something impossible and brought it forward into a world that barely had room for its existence. The responsibility was immense, the future uncertain, and the complications endless. But she'd also been part of something that would echo through history, a discovery that proved life could persist against impossible odds, that extinction wasn't always final, that the world still held mysteries deep enough to humble human arrogance. And when people asked if she'd do it again, knowing what she knew now about the challenges and costs, she always gave the same answer: yes, without hesitation. Because some discoveries changed everything, and being part of that change, being present for the moment when the impossible became real, that was worth any price the future demanded. Sergeant aged beside her through those years, his muzzle going grey, his pace slowing, but his loyalty never wavering. He'd been there from the beginning, had alerted her to the eggs before she understood their significance, had accepted the strange creatures with the same steady competence he brought to all his duties. When he finally passed in his sleep one cold January night, Claire buried him on the ridge overlooking the enclosure where he could watch over the creatures he'd helped discover. The dinosaurs continued to thrive, their presence forcing science to reconsider assumptions about extinction and survival. Universities developed new research programs studying their biology and behavior. Conservation frameworks expanded to include species recovery across geological timescales. And Claire Mendoza's ranch in Montana became a symbol of possibility, proof that the world still held wonders worth discovering. If you've followed this story to its end, maybe you've wondered what you would do in Claire's place, finding something that shouldn't exist and choosing to protect it anyway. Maybe you'd share this story with someone else who understands that the greatest discoveries often come from unexpected places, and that being part of something larger than yourself is both burden and gift. The sun rose over the crazy mountains, painting the world in shades of gold and amber, and in their enclosure the dinosaurs stirred with the dawn, alive and present and impossible. Claire stood watching them, coffee cup in hand, and felt gratitude for the rock slide that had changed everything, for the eggs that had waited so long to wake, for the chance to be part of a story that would outlive her and everyone she knew. The world had expanded to include them, these creatures from deep time, and in doing so had become stranger and more wonderful than any official narrative could capture. That was enough. That was everything. And as the dinosaurs called to each other in voices that echoed across millions of years, Claire called back, maintaining the bond that had begun with a single egg and grown into something that transcended time itself.